Hi there, my name is Greg Walters and I am the Information Services Learning Technologist. Many thanks for attending today's Zoom session focusing on Creative Commons. I'm hoping this session will be useful to everyone as an introduction and overview to what Creative Commons is and how the licenses can be applied. Before we commence into the presentation, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping and then go over what you'll learn during today's session focusing on Creative Commons. Before we go any further, we'll go over some housekeeping. I'm delivering this session via Zoom. It will be recorded using Zoom's inbuilt recording facility and then made available to University of Glasgow staff and students. And can I ask that everyone please mute themselves during this presentation, as in just mute your microphones please, as this will help cut out any background noise. At the end of the presentation, there will be a brief opportunity for question and answers. If anyone has any questions, if you could please put them in the chat box during my presentation and then I'll do my best to answer them at the end. Or if I can't, there is a web address that I'll be displaying at the end as well, and you can send your questions onto there as well. Please note, during my presentation I'll be showing mentioning a number of external resources. Links to these can be found within the chat box during the presentation, so please refer to them there. And I will make these resources available to everyone after the session has concluded via social media and email. Please note none of the content that is discussed during today's presentation, along with the audio and video materials, none of it should be considered legal advice. And with that established, we'll now go over to what we're going to cover during today's session. Over the course of this presentation, we'll examine what Creative Commons licenses are from two different perspectives. We're going to look at from a creator's perspective and from the perspective of a consumer, as in someone who makes use of materials that have a Creative Commons license associated with them. We'll then look at each of the licenses and examine some possible uses for them, before briefly looking at how to provide attribution, which is just credit, and examine its importance in relation to each of the licenses. And as I stated a few moments ago, I may direct you to services or resources for further reading or information. So with that established, we'll now look at what Creative Commons is from a creator's perspective first, and then from a person who is using materials that have a Creative Commons license associated with them. So to examine from a creator's perspective, Creative Commons is a suite of licenses that enable creators to assign a simple and standardized way to give people permission to share and use their creative work. The licenses enable creators to choose how their work is reused, edited and built upon. For example, a creator may choose to only allow a piece of work they create to be reused non-commercially. The licenses aren't tied to any specific means of distribution or platform, so a creator may choose to distribute their work across platforms like Flickr, YouTube and Vimeo, for example. Creative Commons licenses can be used by either individual creators or to large institutions as a simple and standardized method of granting the public permission to use their creative work under copyright law. And it should be noted that there's no cost to using the licenses either. We'll now quickly look at a couple of examples of individual creators and institutions applying Creative Commons licenses to share their creative work with the public. The example we have on screen is an image taken by an individual who has made this lovely image of the university available via Wikimedia Commons under a Creative Commons Zero license, which effectively puts this into the public domain. So that's one example of how an individual creator may apply a Creative Commons mark or license to their work. I will now examine an institution And the image on screen is taken from the Glasgow School of Arts Archives and Collections, where they used Creative Commons to make their images available to the public for educational purposes under a CC BY NC SA license, and we'll go over the components of a CC license shortly. But the takeaway of this example is how an institution used Creative Commons to make their content available to the public under conditions that they chose. And from a consumer perspective, they allow you to reuse the copyright material without having to contact the owner for permission. And each of the licenses tell you how materials can be used, shared and distributed. And we'll now go over the conditions that are commonly associated with each type of Creative Commons license. The Creative Commons licenses contain one or multiple conditions. The creator or copyright owner can decide what conditions they want attached to the license. And we'll take a few moments to go over what each of the license conditions are and what they offer. And we'll start at the top. There's a condition of attribution, where people using the work have to acknowledge or attribute who the creator is, so that's the BY for attribution. The condition of share alike is for those who create an adaptation of a work. They then have an obligation to share it under the same license conditions as the original piece of work, so that's the SA or share alike. Then there's the condition of non-commercial use, which excludes work from being used commercially, that's NC. And finally, the no derivatives condition, where the user is not allowed to create derivatives or adaptations of the work, that's ND for no derivatives. So those are the four conditions that make up the Creative Commons licenses, and in our next slide we'll examine the 6 different types of licenses that these conditions can be used to create. And when the 4 conditions are mixed and matched, they create the 6 Creative Commons licenses that are available, from the most open type of license, that's the CC BY, to CC BY NC ND, which is the most creative, or the most restrictive type of license. And just to further illustrate that, we'll look at the scale on screen. And the scale we have on screen highlights the levels of restriction, with the license at the bottom being the most restrictive of the open licenses, to the ones at the top providing the most freedoms. And right at the top of the scale we have something called public domain, CC0. This is referred to as a public dedication or a public domain dedication tool. And when an author applies this to a work, they waive all their rights and put the work into the public domain. I'd now like to, over the next 6 or 7 slides, I'd now like to go over each of these licenses in a bit more detail. And the CC BY, this license allows reusers to distribute, remix, adapt and build upon the material in any medium or format, so long as attribution is given to the creator. The license allows for commercial use. Materials that have this license type associated with it are versatile, as they can be used in a thesis, teaching materials, and even massive online open courses, MOOCs, providing attribution to the creator is provided. CC BY SA, this license allows reusers to distribute, remix, adapt and build upon the material in any medium or format, providing attribution is given to the creator. The license allows for commercial use. If you remix, adapt or build upon the original material, you must license the modified material, what you produce, under identical terms, i.e. for example the same license, which would be CC BY SA. CC BY NC, This license allows reusers to distribute, remix, adapt and build upon the material in any medium or format for non-commercial purposes only, and only so long as attribution is given to the creator. When non-commercial NC is introduced to a license, you can observe that certain uses become more restricted. For example, materials that have this license type wouldn't be suitable for use in a MOOC course, as they have a commercial element associated with them. CC BY NC SA. This license allows reusers to distribute, remix, adapt and build upon the material in any medium or format for non-commercial purposes only, and only so long as attribution is given to the creator. If you remix, adapt or build upon the material, you must license the modified material under identical terms. CC BY ND. This license allows reusers to copy and distribute material in any medium or format in unadapted form only, and only so long as attribution is given to the creator. The license allows for commercial use. The no derivatives aspect of this license does make the reuse more limited, as you cannot adapt, edit or build upon the original material. Therefore, you will have to carefully consider how you intend to use this type of material. CC BY NC ND. This license allows reusers to copy and distribute the material in any medium or format, providing it's for non-commercial purposes, is unmodified, and attribution to the provider. An attribution is provided for the creator of the original work. As we saw in the previous slide, this is the most restrictive Creative Commons license type. Due to the restrictions of not being able to modify the original work and the exclusion of not being able to distribute works commercially. We will examine both the CC0 and the public domain mark, as these are different in their application and use compared to the licenses that make use of the 4 conditions we spoke about earlier. Both of these are effectively public domain tools, which enable those authors or creators a means of dedicating their works to the worldwide public. CC0 enables creators and owners of copyright or database protected content to waive those interests in their works and thereby place them as completely as possible in the public domain, so that others may freely build upon, enhance and reuse the works for any purpose without restriction under copyright or database law. Creative Commons public domain mark is an effective method of marking works that are no longer restricted by copyright in a simple and standardized way. This also helps making them identifiable and more discoverable to others. It may be mostly cultural heritage institutions like libraries, museums, etc. who possibly make use of this tool as a means of making their materials like manuscripts, books and paintings in their collections available to the public. Only use this tool if you have identified a work that is free of known copyright restrictions. Creative Commons does not recommend this tool for works that are restricted by copyright laws in one or more jurisdictions. Items to consider before applying a Creative Commons license to your work. When you apply a Creative Commons license or CC0 to material, these cannot be revoked. This means anyone who receives or uses the materials can rely on the license that was applied for as long as the material is protected by copyright, even if you decide to stop distributing it later on. When applying a license to a piece of work, you must own or control the copyright. Only the copyright holder or someone who has express permission from the copyright holder can apply either a Creative Commons license or CC0 to a copyrighted work. It's worth noting if you created a piece of work through the course of your job, you may not be the rights holder to the copyright. When it comes to applying a CC license or Creative Commons license to a piece of work you've created, there's no requirement to fill out forms or applications. All you have to do is pick a license you think applies to the work you've created, and then communicate this choice in a clear way to people who may use your work. For more guidance on choosing a license, I would suggest examining the Creative Commons License Chooser. Again, the link to this can be found in the chat box. No derivatives. Before we examine how to provide attribution when using Creative Commons materials, I'd like to examine both the no derivative and non-commercial aspects conditions, as these can be quite complex areas. Over this slide and the next one, we'll examine no derivative, and you can see the two CC licenses that incorporate the no derivative condition and what is allowed and not. You'll see the licenses highlighted in blue near the top of the screen. Notice both derivative work or adaptation are both prohibited. I'd like to expand on what may be considered an adaptation, as this is important to consider when trying to determine if what you've produced is an adaptation or not. When looking from a purely copyright perspective, which will mean it may vary depending on the jurisdiction, but a classic or well-known examples would be a translation or converting a play or novel into a movie. These are classic examples of adaptation. We'll now go on to examine no derivatives from the lens of, or through the lens of, education. The examples on screen are acts that do not constitute adaptations. For example, format shifting would not be considered an adaptation. Therefore, someone using a ND or no derivative license work would be able to convert that work from a digital format like streamed format, for example, to a physical format like a DVD or Blu-ray without infringing or violating the conditions of the license. Fixing minor spelling errors or punctuation would not be considered a violation. Reproducing a work as part of a collection is not an active adaptation, but of reproduction, so no violation is committed. Unless an image itself is adapted, then including it in relation to text, or in a blog post, or within a presentation would not be considered an adaptation. You can find more examples in the source highlighted in the bottom of the screen, or the bottom right hand corner of the screen, called Creative Commons for Educators and Librarians. For further reading, you may wish to consider reading the article linked to in the chat box called Why Sharing Academic Publications Under No Derivatives Licenses is Misguided. We'll now examine the non-commercial or NC aspect. The definition of non-commercial focuses on the use that is made and not on the user. For example, a non-profit may very well do uses of a work that are considered commercial and vice versa. A commercial company would be able to use a NC license that doesn't violate the conditions of the license. So just to clarify, don't focus on the organisation or individuals who are using the NC license. It's how it's going to be used is the important factor. Usually questions are asked around, is my use non-commercial? And the answer to that is it depends a lot on the specifics of the situation and the attention of the user. A good rule of thumb is if you want to use an NC license work, you cannot charge the public to access or to use the work, or it can't be put behind a paywall. And to follow on from the previous slide, there are plenty of borderline cases. For specific guidance relating to borderline or harder to determine cases, I would suggest referring to the resources highlighted on screen. I've posted the links to these in the chat box. One is called Brief Guide to Non-Commercial Interpretation. This provides a more detailed explanation about the meaning of the NC license and some key points to pay attention to. You can also refer to the survey conducted in 2008, which gauged the opinion of what users consider to be commercial and non-commercial. Again, the link to this survey can be found in the chat box. What I'd like to touch on briefly is limitations and exceptions still apply. So if you chose to use a work that has a NC license attached to it, you still may be able to use a limitation or one of the UK copyright exceptions to defend it. Finally, in relation to non-commercial use, there's a list on screen which illustrates some examples. So what's not allowed? You can't include an NC essay as part of a collection in a commercially distributed book of essays, even if it's only a small portion of the book. It's not allowed to include a resource licensed by CC BY-NC into a course pack for students to buy at the bookstore, unless the charge covers only cost recovery for copying. However, what is allowed, for-profit university may still include a link to NC licensed courseware in a syllabus or on its paywalled website. The CC license never comes into play and the NC restriction may be disregarded. A school can outsource the copying of NC released material to a commercial printing company. The Great Minds case. Please note for the Great Minds case, it was United States case that decided that, so just bear that in mind. It wasn't UK law that was applied to that in that particular instance. And just to summarise, not all educational uses are necessarily non-commercial. We have to examine the specifics to determine that. We'll now move into our final area, where we will briefly examine the best practice around providing attribution credit to the creator when we decide to use work that has a Creative Commons license associated with it. On screen we have an ideal example of an attribution that links to the image source, the creator and the license. The reason the example on screen is an ideal attribution is because the title of the image is mentioned along with the original source, and the creator is given credit with the CC license being linked to. Notice also the four elements the ideal attribution includes: the title, the author, the source and the license. All of these should be included when providing attribution for the use of CC based works. For further guidance on Creative Commons attribution, I would suggest viewing the link in the chat box titled Creative Commons Attribution Learning Object. And thank you, the session has concluded, and for the purposes of the video recording I'll make the links available that were mentioned during the presentation available in the description. You will see links there. Thanks again for your time. Many thanks.